She was tearing his family's reputation apart before she even knew his name. Gisul watched from across the gallery, amused, then unsettled, as the woman in the green dress dismantled a project worth millions without blinking once. No fear. No performance. No idea who he was. 20 minutes into the argument, an aide leaned toward her and whispered the truth, and her face changed completely. She had just insulted a dynasty to its heir. He expected her to panic. Instead, watching her walk away unbothered, Gisul felt something he had never once needed to control, wanting. Welcome back to Afroco Stories, my amazing family. I'm so happy to have you here once again. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our powerful stories. And please take a quick second to like this video, drop a comment, and share it with someone who loves emotional stories. It really helps the channel grow and boosts our community. Now get comfortable, because today's story is intense. Let's dive right in. Researchers have found that we're often drawn fastest to people who refuse to flatter us, because unearned honesty feels rarer than compliments ever will. That's exactly what happens to Gisul in this story. Dior never once tries to impress him. Have you ever been more attracted to someone for challenging you than for complimenting you? Tell me in the comments. The exhibition hall smelled of fresh paint and old money. Crystal light fell over glass cases holding architectural models nobody in the room could afford to critique honestly, because honesty required something most guests didn't have nothing to lose. Gisul moved through it the way he moved through everything, unhurried, unreadable, watched by everyone and approached by no one who mattered. He had already greeted the minister, already nodded at the gallery owner, already endured 3 separate mothers steering their daughters into his eyeline like ships adjusting course. He was 3 drinks from leaving when he heard a voice cut through the polite murmur like a blade through silk. This is a beautiful building that has clearly never met a child. She was standing in front of a library model, arms folded, speaking to the curator as if she hadn't noticed half the room had gone quiet around her. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had never once considered softening her opinion for an audience. Gisul found himself walking toward the conversation before he decided to. "You don't think it's functional?" he asked, stepping beside her, addressing the model rather than her, giving her room to answer without knowing who had spoken. She turned, unbothered by the interruption. "Functional for what? For photographs?" The reading nooks are 3 feet off the ground with no railing. The shelves are visually elegant and completely inaccessible to a child under 4 feet tall. Somebody designed this to be admired, not used. Maybe it was designed to inspire, Gisul offered, watching her more than the model now. "Inspiration doesn't teach a 7-year-old to read," she said. "Access does." He almost smiled. It had been a long time since anyone in this room had spoken to him like he might be wrong. "You sound very certain for someone critiquing a project she doesn't work on." "I don't need to work on it to see it's built for people who'll never use it," she said, finally looking at him properly, the kind of look that assessed a person's argument rather than a suit. "Do you work in architecture?" "Something like that," Gisul said. For the next 20 minutes, they argued about accessibility, about beauty as a substitute for usefulness, about who cities are actually built for, about whether elegant design and community design were the same thing at all. She disagreed with him twice as often as she agreed, and each time she did, something in his chest loosened slightly, like a knot he hadn't noticed tightening over years finally being touched. She did not ask his name. She did not angle the conversation toward his watch, his tailoring, the way 3 separate people had already tried to catch his attention from across the room. She argued like the outcome mattered more than the audience. Her name was Dior, she told him eventually, only because he'd asked directly, and she answered the way she answered everything plainly, without performance. She had grown up outside Dakar, she said, in a house where family filled every room and every argument ended in laughter, and she had built her entire career on a single stubborn belief. That beautiful spaces meant nothing if ordinary people couldn't move through them with dignity. She'd spent years now moving between Seoul and home, consulting on public spaces, refusing every offer that asked her to design for prestige instead of people. An aide appeared at Gisul's shoulder before he could ask anything else, murmuring a name and a time into his ear, the kind of interruption that could not be waved away. Gisul excused himself, and it was only as he turned that the aide, unaware of what he was undoing, added quietly, "The family will want your thoughts on the library model before the trustees leave, sir." Dior's expression shifted slowly, calculation moving behind her eyes as she connected the model, the family, the man she had just spent 20 minutes correcting. This is your family's project." "It is. You let me criticize it for 20 minutes. You were right about the railing." She laughed, short and surprised, pressing her fingers briefly to her forehead. "You could have told me who you were." "You never asked," Gisul said simply. She studied him for a moment longer, something amused and unbothered settling over her features instead of the apology he half expected. "Fine. I stand by the railing." "Will I see you again?" he asked, and hated slightly how much he meant it. "Maybe," she said, already turning, already walking, leaving the word behind her like a door left deliberately unlocked. He watched her go until the crowd swallowed her, and the aide had to say his name twice before he responded. It was, Gisul would think much later, the first time in his adult life that a woman had walked away from him, and he had felt the loss of it immediately, physically, like missing a step in the dark. The following weeks moved the way his weeks always moved, board meetings disguised as family dinners, foundation reports that meant nothing beside the private ledgers only 3 people in the family were permitted to see. Obligations stacked on obligations until the days blurred into a single long negotiation. But underneath all of it, quietly, persistently, he kept thinking about a woman who had criticized his family's building without knowing it was his, and hadn't changed a single word when she found out. 2 weeks later, an invitation crossed his desk for a charity development event, a partnership between his family's foundation and an urban design nonprofit working across 3 continents. He recognized the nonprofit's name before he reached the bottom of the page. He recognized, more than that, the sudden interest he took in an event he would ordinarily have delegated without a second thought. She was there in cream and gold, standing near a display of community housing renderings, and this time, when she saw him crossing the room toward her, she didn't pretend to be surprised. "I wondered if you'd come find me or send someone to vet me first," she said. "Would vetting have worked?" "No," Dior said. "But it would have been very on brand." He laughed, actually laughed, and felt several people nearby turn at the unfamiliar sound of it. "I take it you've done your research on my family since the exhibition." "I have," she said. "Which is why I have several questions about whether this foundation's housing initiative actually serves the neighborhoods it claims to, or just photographs well for your annual report." "You really don't do small talk." "I do plenty of small talk," Dior said. "Just not with people who could actually change something and choose not to ask hard questions instead." He should have been irritated. He had spent his entire adult life around people who understood, instinctively, the difference between what could be said to him and what could not. Dior had apparently decided that difference didn't exist, and instead of resenting it, Gisul found himself leaning into the conversation the way a man leans into wine he's decided not to fight. They spent the better part of an hour walking the exhibit floor together, her pointing out design choices that looked generous on paper and hollow in practice, him defending some of it out of habit and abandoning the defense the moment her argument outpaced his. Somewhere in that hour, without either of them naming it, the conversation stopped being a negotiation and became something closer to companionship, 2 people who disagreed on purpose because agreement would have been less interesting. "You're not what I expected from a foundation heir," she admitted eventually, as the crowd began to thin. "What did you expect?" "Someone who nods along in meetings and lets other people care on his behalf." "And now?" "Now I think you actually want to know if the work is real," she said. "Which is rarer than you'd think in rooms like this." He walked her to her car that night, an act so ordinary it startled him. He could not remember the last time he had done something so plainly unnecessary for a woman, without an aide managing the logistics or a security detail scanning the street first. Dior didn't seem to notice the significance of it. She simply talked, easily, about a project in Dakar she was hoping to expand, about her mother's insistence that she was working too much, about a market near her childhood home that sold the best grilled fish in the world, and no argument would ever convince her otherwise. "I should go," she said finally, keys in hand, the streetlight catching gold in her earrings. "You should," he agreed, and didn't move. She smiled at that, slow and knowing, before sliding into the car. "You're going to be a problem, aren't you? I was about to think the same thing about you." She was still smiling when she drove away, and Gisul stood on the curb long after the taillights disappeared, aware for the first time in longer than he could measure that he was not thinking about the family, the foundation, the ledgers waiting on his desk, or any obligation at all. He was only thinking about when he would see her again, and how unfamiliar it felt to want something this simple this badly. Over the following month, again, became a pattern neither of them acknowledged out loud. They met for what began as professional conversations, a walkthrough of a community center Dior was consulting on, a dinner disguised as a foundation discussion, a late coffee that had nothing to do with either of their jobs, and both of them knew it. Gisul found reasons to be in rooms she would be in. Dior, for her part, stopped pretending she needed a reason at all. "You know, people are starting to talk," she told him one evening, over dinner at a restaurant quiet enough that talking wasn't a risk, only an observation. "People always talk," Gisul said. "It's the family's primary export." "I'm serious. Your world is small at the top. People notice patterns. Does that bother you?" Dior considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. "It should. I've watched what happens to women who get pulled into families like yours and lose themselves trying to fit the shape of what's expected. I've told myself for years I'd never let that happen to me. And now? Now I keep showing up anyway," she said, "which either means I'm braver than I thought or significantly less careful." "I'd like to think it's the first one." "You would," she said, but she was smiling when she said it, and something in Gisul's chest settled the way it only ever seemed to when she was in the room. Word of them reached his grandmother before Gisul ever mentioned Dior's name at home. That was how the family always worked. Information moved through the house like water through old pipes, quiet and constant and impossible to fully stop. He was summoned to her study on a Sunday, tea already poured, which meant the conversation had already been decided before he walked in. "A consultant," his grandmother said, testing the word like it might be foreign. "Senegalese. Her name is Dior," Gisul said. "I know her name. I know her firm, her clients, and the fact that she has turned down 3 introductions arranged by people who thought they were doing her a favor." His grandmother studied him over the rim of her cup. "That is either very foolish or very deliberate. She doesn't want anything from us." "Everyone wants something," his grandmother said, not unkindly, simply certain, the way she was certain about most things after 70 years of watching people arrange themselves around her family's name. "The clever ones only learn to ask for it quietly." Gisul said nothing, because there was nothing to say that his grandmother would accept as true, and because some private, unfamiliar part of him did not want to hand this particular thing over for the family to examine yet. He left the conversation the way he left most conversations in that house, outwardly composed, privately unmoved, carrying something he had no intention of surrendering. Dior felt the shift before anyone told her what it meant. A photographer she didn't recognize lingered too long outside a site visit. A colleague mentioned, too casually, that her name had come up at a dinner she hadn't attended. She said nothing to Gisul about it at first, turning the discomfort over privately, weighing whether she was imagining a spotlight that wasn't really there. "You're quieter tonight," Gisul said, the next time they met, at a small restaurant tucked behind a bookstore neither of them had been to before. "I think your family is watching me," she said finally. "They are," he admitted, because lying to her had never once occurred to him as an option worth taking. "My grandmother asked about you yesterday." "And what did you tell her?" "That you don't want anything from us." Dior turned her glass slowly on the table, considering him. "Is that going to be a problem? Someone who doesn't want anything from a family that measures people by what they're willing to take?" Gisul didn't answer immediately, because he didn't yet know the true shape of the answer, only that some part of him had already decided it didn't matter what the family measured, as long as she kept looking at him the way she was looking at him now, plainly. Unafraid, waiting for him to be honest instead of comfortable. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "But I know I'm not ready to stop finding out." The following weeks folded into a rhythm that felt, to Gisul, dangerously close to ordinary life. Dinners that ran long because neither of them wanted to be the one to end them. Arguments about zoning laws that somehow became arguments about family, about culture, about what it meant to build something that actually belonged to you instead of something you'd simply inherited. Dior spoke about Senegal the way other people spoke about religion, with reverence, with humor, with an honesty that never tried to make it sound simpler than it was. She called her mother every Sunday without fail, and twice Gisul sat across from her at dinner while she laughed at something said 6,000 miles away and found himself unreasonably jealous of a phone call. "You get a very specific look when I talk about home," Dior said once, catching him watching her. "What look?" "Like you're trying to memorize something you're afraid you'll lose." He didn't correct her because she wasn't wrong. A gallery reopening brought them into the same room again a few weeks later, this time surrounded by people who all recognized him and none of whom knew quite what to make of the woman standing easily at his side, unclaimed and unbothered by their attention. A junior diplomat spent 20 minutes trying to charm her, complimenting her work with the kind of practiced flattery Gisul had heard aimed at 100 other women in rooms exactly like this one. Dior handled it with polite disinterest, redirecting the conversation twice, laughing at the right moments without ever once inviting more. Gisul watched the entire exchange from across the room with a stillness that unsettled even himself. It wasn't rage exactly. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable, the specific, unfamiliar ache of watching someone he had no formal claim to be spoken to like she might be available. When he finally crossed the room, it was with a control so deliberate it took effort. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked low, once the diplomat had excused himself. "He was harmless," Dior said, reading him easily. "You didn't need to come rescue me." "I wasn't rescuing you." "No? I was reminding myself I have no right to want to." Dior went quiet at that, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite read, somewhere between amusement and something more careful. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me all night. If this story has you hooked, tap like and drop your thoughts below. Now, back to the story." It was an argument, in the end, that finally broke the careful distance they had both been maintaining without naming it. They were at his apartment, the city spread out silver and endless below the windows, disagreeing, as they always did, about something that mattered less than the way they disagreed about it. This time it was about a decision he'd made without consulting her on a joint community project, a small thing, a scheduling call he'd rearranged without asking. "You do that," Dior said, arms crossed. "You decide things and expect everyone to adjust around the decision. You don't even notice you're doing it." "I run an empire that doesn't wait for consensus," Gisul said. "It's not a habit I get to turn off selectively." "Then turn it off with me. You don't always have to be the most powerful person in the room." The words landed somewhere he hadn't expected them to reach, quiet and unguarded. "I don't know how to be anything else," he admitted, and hated slightly how true it sounded out loud, stripped of the composure he wore into every other room of his life. Dior's expression softened, the anger draining out of it into something gentler. She crossed the space between them, close enough that he could see the exact moment her own certainty wavered. "With me, you don't have to perform," she said quietly. "You never had to." He didn't move first. He had promised himself, somewhere in the weeks before this, that he wouldn't be the one to close that particular distance. That whatever happened between them would happen because she chose it and not because his family had spent his whole life teaching him to take what he wanted. So he waited, and it was Dior who finally closed the space, rising onto her toes, her hand settling against his jaw like she'd been imagining exactly where to put it for weeks. The kiss was slow in a way neither of them had expected from two people who argued as fast and hard as they did, careful, deliberate, both of them holding back at first as though testing whether the ground beneath this decision would actually hold. It did. When they finally broke apart, Dior exhaled a small, startled laugh against his mouth, like she'd surprised herself as much as she'd surprised him. "Well," she said, "that complicates the community schedule considerably." I'll live with it, Gisul said, and kissed her again. What began that night didn't rush toward anything. Over the following weeks, whatever had cracked open between them deepened slowly, carefully, in 100 small unspoken ways, a hand that lingered too long, a silence across a dinner table that no longer needed filling, the particular quiet of being in a room together with nothing left to prove. Gisul, who had spent his entire adult life keeping some private, guarded part of himself out of reach of everyone, found that part of himself dissolving steadily in her presence, replaced by something far more vulnerable than he was used to being. Dior discovered, beneath the composure and command that ran his public life, a man who had never once been wanted simply for himself, and who received that wanting like a starving man handed a plain, ordinary meal, and finding it the best thing he'd ever tasted. Their private evenings together became something neither of them spoke about directly, held instead in glances and the particular gravity of a room when they were finally, quietly alone. The emotional trust between them turning into something that no longer needed to explain itself, only to be felt, unhurried, in the closeness neither of them was willing to name out loud yet for fear of making it smaller by saying it. But trust, for Dior, came with its own quiet fear. A week after everything shifted between them, she pulled back without announcing it. Fewer calls returned quickly, a dinner postponed with a reason that sounded thinner than it was meant to. She told herself she was protecting something, though she couldn't yet name what. "You've been distant," Gisul said finally, arriving at her apartment unannounced, something he had never once done before. "I've been busy." "You've been scared," he corrected gently. "Tell me what of." Dior exhaled, leaning against her doorframe, finally letting the honesty surface. "Men like you don't usually keep women like me. You keep us interesting for a while, and then your family finds someone who fits the picture better, and I go back to being a story you tell at dinners about the time you dated an architect from Senegal. Is that truly what you think of me?" "I think it's what happens," she said. "I've watched it happen to other women. I told myself I'd never let it happen to me." Gisul stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head to hold his eyes. "Then don't measure me by other men," he said. "Measure me by what I do next." He didn't leave that night, and for the first time since the fear had crept in, Dior let herself believe, if only a little, that this might be different from every warning she had carried into it. The test of that belief came sooner than either of them expected. His grandmother, having watched the pattern continue longer than she was comfortable with, invited Dior to tea under the guise of foundation business and made her offer plainly, the way she made every important decision, without cruelty, simply without doubt that it would work. "You're an intelligent woman," his grandmother said, sliding a folded document across the table, a settlement figure large enough to fund a decade of Dior's independent projects without a single client. "Intelligent women understand the value of walking away from something before it costs them more than it gives them." Dior looked at the document for a long moment, then slid it back across the table unopened. "If Gisul can't choose his own partner without his family negotiating on his behalf," she said calmly, "then he isn't ready to have a partner at all. That's not an insult to you. It's simply true. I won't be the thing that proves it." She left the tea room with her composure fully intact, and it was 3 days before Gisul learned what had happened, from his grandmother herself, delivered almost as a warning. "She refused it without blinking," his grandmother said, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "I have never seen that happen before." Gisul said nothing for a long moment, feeling something settle into place inside him with a finality that surprised even him. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and said the only thing that felt true. "Then you should understand this clearly once. Dior is not an asset to this family, an alliance to be negotiated, or an acquisition to be priced. If you approach her again, you will be dealing with me directly, not with her patience." His grandmother studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her expression that had nothing to do with anger. It was, Gisul would understand only later, the exact moment his family stopped seeing this as infatuation and started, quietly, to reckon with the possibility that he had actually changed. Dior heard about the confrontation secondhand, through a foundation staffer who hadn't realized how much weight the story carried when she repeated it. She said nothing to Gisul when he arrived that evening, only studied him for a long moment across the room, something in her expression softer than it had been in weeks. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I didn't do it for you," Gisul said. "I did it because it was true. You simply happened to be the reason I finally said it out loud." She crossed the room slowly, and this time there was no hesitation in the way she reached for him, no careful measuring of how much to allow herself to feel. Whatever fear had been living quietly beneath her composure for weeks loosened its grip that night, replaced by something steadier, the particular, unguarded ease of two people who had each, in their own way, proven they weren't going anywhere. That evening became one neither of them spoke about afterward in detail, held instead in the way Dior's laughter came easier the following morning, in the way Gisul lingered at her apartment long past when duty would have called him elsewhere, in the quiet, deliberate tenderness neither of them had known the other was capable of until they'd stopped guarding against it. It wasn't a single dramatic turn. It was closeness built slowly enough to trust, arriving finally, fully, without either of them needing to announce that everything had changed. "I could get used to this," Dior admitted, much later, her voice soft against the dark. "Good," Gisul said. "Because I already have." For a while, it felt like the hardest part was behind them, the family scrutiny, the fear of being temporary, the careful walls both of them had spent years building against exactly this kind of closeness. But love, Gisul was beginning to learn, rarely stayed still long enough to be declared finished. Just as one danger settled, another arrived quietly, wearing the shape of an opportunity instead of a threat. It came in the form of an email Dior read twice before she believed it, an offer to lead a major international development initiative headquartered in Dakar, the kind of position she had spent her entire career building toward without ever quite admitting she wanted it this badly. It would mean months away from Seoul at a time. It would mean, potentially, choosing between the work that had always been hers and the man who had only recently become part of her life at all. She didn't tell Gisul immediately. For 3 days, she carried the offer privately, turning it over the way she turned over every important decision, unwilling to let anyone, even him, shape her answer before she'd found it herself. When she finally told him, over a quiet dinner she'd chosen specifically for its distance from anywhere his family might overhear, she watched his face carefully, braced for the version of him that solved problems with resources instead of understanding. "Dakar," Gisul repeated slowly. "For how long?" 18 months, possibly longer. "It's the work I've wanted my entire career, Gisul." "I can't pretend it isn't." "Then don't," he said, and something in his tone made her look up sharply, expecting resistance and finding, instead, something closer to fear. "I only need to know what you want me to do." "I don't need you to do anything," Dior said carefully. "That's rather the point." He didn't argue with her that night, though she could see the calculation moving behind his eyes, the particular restlessness of a man who had spent his entire life solving problems by controlling their conditions. She recognized it, and some old, careful part of her braced for what came next. A few days later, Dior arrived at what she thought was a small dinner and found instead a private office space already furnished, a proposal for a satellite foundation branch in Dakar already drafted, staff positions already sketched out on paper with her name attached to none of it and every decision made around her. Gisul watched her reaction with the cautious hope of a man who believed he'd solved something. "What is this?" she asked, quiet in a way that should have warned him. "A solution," Gisul said. "You wouldn't have to choose. You could run the Dakar work through the foundation, keep your independence, and I could restructure my schedule to spend more time there myself. You built an entire office without asking me a single question about what I actually wanted. I was trying to remove the obstacle." "I'm not an obstacle to be removed, Gisul. This is my life's work, and you just tried to redesign it around yourself without asking me one thing about how I wanted to build it." Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried a weight sharper than anger. "Loving me doesn't mean solving me. It means supporting the life I already built, not replacing it with one that's more convenient for you." The words landed the way her words always seemed to land with him, unfiltered by rank or reputation, striking exactly where they needed to. Gisul stood in the middle of the office he'd built in a week without her, and for the first time understood, fully, the difference between wanting to help someone and wanting to control the shape of their life so it never inconvenienced his own. "You're right," he said finally, quietly. "I don't know how to want something without trying to own it. That's what this family taught me. I'm asking you to teach me the other way." Dior studied him for a long moment, some of the sharpness in her expression softening into something more patient. "Then start by asking. Not building. Not deciding. Asking." It took weeks to unlearn a habit built over 30 years, and Gisul did not manage it perfectly. But he asked, from then on, before he acted, about the Dakar partnership, about her schedule, about what kind of support would help rather than what kind would simply make him feel useful. Together, slowly, they built something neither of them had drafted alone, a Seoul-Dakar architectural partnership under his legitimate foundation, structured so Dior remained fully independent, leading her own projects, answerable to no one's family name but her own reputation. "This is what I wanted," she told him, the night the partnership papers were finalized. "Not a rescue. A partner." "I'm still learning the difference," Gisul admitted. "I know," Dior said, and kissed him like it was proof enough that she believed he would. The following months settled into something neither of them had quite dared to imagine at the gallery all those months ago, a life stitched together across 2 continents, built on video calls at strange hours and reunions at airports that neither of them tried to make look composed. Gisul learned to hold his need for control loosely where she was concerned, and Dior learned, slowly, to let herself be held by a world that had once terrified her without letting it swallow the woman she'd built herself into. Their closeness deepened into something unhurried and certain, a private tenderness neither of them performed for anyone else, held instead in quiet mornings and long evenings, and the particular ease of 2 people who had stopped needing to prove anything to the other. But dynasties, Gisul had learned early, rarely allow peace to last uncontested. The trouble arrived at a family gathering disguised as a celebration, his grandmother announcing, with the careful timing of someone who had planned it for weeks, an expectation the entire family had apparently been quietly building toward. A politically advantageous match with the daughter of an allied family, a match that would consolidate influence the way the family had consolidated everything for generations, through strategic marriage instead of choice. "It isn't official yet," his grandmother said carefully, watching him. "But an announcement would strengthen the family's position considerably during the merger negotiations. It would be expected of you, as it was expected of your father." Gisul said nothing in the room full of relatives who all seemed to already understand what was being asked of him, and it wasn't until he told Dior, later that night, that he understood the true weight of the moment. She listened without interrupting, her expression carefully still, the kind of stillness he'd learned meant she was working hard to control something larger underneath it. "And what did you say?" she asked finally. "I said nothing yet. I wanted to talk to you first." "That's not good enough, Gisul." Her voice, when it came, was quieter than he expected, which frightened him more than anger would have. "I love you. I have loved you for longer than I probably should have let myself, given everything I knew about what a life with you might cost me. But I will not become someone's secret, and I will not be treated like an inconvenient exception to a decision your family has already made for you. You need to choose, and you need to choose out loud, because I won't spend my life waiting quietly to find out if I was ever really chosen at all." She left him with that, and for the first time since she'd walked away from him at the gallery all those months ago, Gisul understood that this time, if he let her go, she would not be coming back to argue with him about it later. He did not sleep that night. He sat alone in the dark of his apartment, turning over 30 years of a life built entirely around calculation, every relationship measured, every decision weighed against consequence, every desire filtered first through what the family required of him. And for the first time in his life, he found he no longer wanted to calculate anything at all. The following week, at a gathering meant to formalize the very alliance his grandmother had been quietly building, Gisul stood before the assembled family and the allied family's representatives, and did the one thing none of them expected from a man who had spent his entire life managing outcomes carefully. "I want to be honest with all of you," because this family has built its entire foundation on strategic silence, and I no longer intend to participate in that particular tradition," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the room. "There will be no engagement announcement tonight, or at any point after tonight, to anyone chosen on my behalf. I have already chosen. Her name is Dior, and she is the woman I intend to build my life with. I understand that decision may not please everyone in this room. I have made my peace with that." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Gisul had ever stood inside. His grandmother, watching from across the room, said nothing for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the particular way that had unsettled boardrooms for 40 years. Then, finally, something shifted in her face, not approval exactly, but something adjacent to it, the recognition of a man who had finally stopped performing the role she'd spent his whole life training him to play. "Some relatives may never approve," she said quietly, to him alone, once the room had begun to disperse into uncomfortable conversation. "But I find, watching you say that I am no longer entirely certain approval was ever what mattered most in this family. Only survival was. Perhaps you found a different way to manage that. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't quite blessing either. But it was," Gisul understood, the closest thing to peace his grandmother knew how to offer, and he accepted it as exactly that. Dior heard what happened before he could tell her himself, the story moving through the family's careful channels faster than he could reach her. When he arrived at her apartment, she was standing in the doorway already, arms crossed, something unreadable in her expression that made his chest tighten with an old, familiar fear. "You did that in front of everyone," she said. "I did. Without calculating what it would cost you. For the first time in my life," Gisul admitted, "I chose something without weighing what it would cost me first. I chose you out loud, because you were right, you deserve to be chosen, not tolerated. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it where it mattered." Dior closed the distance between them slowly, the same way she had the night of their first kiss, deliberate and certain, like she'd already decided the answer and simply needed a moment to arrive at it. "Then say it again," she said softly. "Just to me this time. No family. No room full of witnesses. Just us." "I love you," Gisul said, plainly, the way she had always said everything to him. "Not the version of you that fits my world. All of you. Exactly as you are." "I love you too," Dior said. "Even the parts of you that took entirely too long to figure that out." In the weeks before the wedding, Dior's mother arrived in Seoul for the first time, and Gisul found himself more nervous meeting one woman from a modest house outside Dakar than he had ever been walking into a boardroom of trustees who controlled half his family's fortune. She studied him for a long, unhurried moment on the day they met, the way Dior studied buildings before deciding whether they'd been built with care. "My daughter does not choose easily," she said finally, in careful, deliberate English. "If she chose you, it is because she saw something worth the trouble of choosing. Do not make her regret the trouble." "I don't intend to," Gisul said. "Good," she said, and to his surprise smiled. "Then we will get along fine." His grandmother, for her part, invited Dior's mother to tea the following week, the two women speaking for hours in a language of mothers that needed no formal translation, comparing notes on children who had grown into people neither of them had fully predicted. Gisul, passing the study door and hearing his grandmother laugh at something Dior's mother had said, understood that whatever quiet war his family had once waged against this relationship had finally, fully, ended, not in surrender, but in something closer to relief. "They like each other," Dior said later, still faintly astonished by it. "I did not see that coming." "Neither did I," Gisul admitted. "I think we underestimated how much your mother and my grandmother have in common. Neither of them has ever once let anyone else make a decision for them. That," Dior said, "explains a great deal about both of us." Their wedding, when it came months later, was nothing like the alliance his family had once imagined for him. No political guest list, no strategic seating chart, no performance built for cameras or trustees. It was small, deliberate, held somewhere between his world and hers, with her mother flown in from Senegal to sit in the front row beside a grandmother who had, against every early expectation, come to genuinely respect the woman her grandson had chosen. Dior wore gold that caught the light the same way it had the night they first truly spoke, and Gisul watched her walk toward him thinking, not for the first time, that she was nothing like the woman he had once imagined choosing, and exactly, entirely, the only one he could imagine building a future beside. In the years that followed, Dior continued leading her international projects, her name attached to public spaces across 2 continents that served exactly the people they were built for, while Gisul worked quietly to separate his family's legitimate future from the darker legacy he'd inherited, one careful decision at a time. Their home became a place neither of them had to perform in, filled slowly with the particular, ordinary joy of a life built on choice instead of obligation, of 2 people who had each, in their own way, refused to disappear into what the other's world expected of them. He had spent his entire life certain he understood exactly what he wanted, groomed from birth to recognize value, influence, and advantage from across a crowded room. It took a woman who wanted none of those things from him to teach him that what he'd actually needed, all along, was someone strong enough to stand in front of him and refuse to be impressed, someone who made him want, for the first time in his life, to build something that was entirely, finally, his own. A little over a year into their marriage, on an ordinary evening that neither of them would later be able to fully describe as ordinary again, Dior sat him down at the kitchen table of the apartment they'd chosen together, smaller than anything his family owned. Deliberately, because she'd insisted a home should feel lived in rather than displayed, and told him quietly that their family was about to grow. Gisul, a man who had spent his entire adult life composed in front of trustees, negotiators, and men far more dangerous than any boardroom rival, sat in stunned, unguarded silence for a long moment before he laughed, low and disbelieving, and pulled her into him like he was afraid the news might slip away if he let go too soon. A king who once thought he had everything already planned, Dior said against his shoulder, is now going to have to learn to plan for someone who won't listen to a word of it. Good, Gisul said. I could use the practice. Word reached his grandmother within the week, delivered not by an aide, not by careful family channels, but by Gisul himself, standing in her study exactly as he had the day she'd first questioned Dior's intentions. This time, there was no folded document between them, no calculation in the room at all, only a man who had once believed love was a liability the family couldn't afford, now standing in front of the woman who'd raised him, unable to keep the joy off his face. His grandmother rose slowly from her chair, crossed the room, and did something she had not done since he was a boy small enough to be lifted onto her lap. She took his face gently between her hands and studied him the way she once studied every important decision the family would ever make. You built a different future after all, she said quietly. I was wrong to think you couldn't. I had helped, Gisul said. Yes, his grandmother agreed, something warm finally settling into her expression. I imagine you did. That night, back in the small apartment that felt more like home than any house he'd grown up in, Gisul stood at the window with Dior beside him. The city spread out below exactly as it had been the first night he'd walked her to her car and refused to admit how much he already wanted to see her again. He thought, watching her reflection in the glass, of the woman who had once dismantled his family's building in front of 40 strangers without an ounce of fear, and understood that everything that mattered in his life since had grown directly out of that single moment of refusing to be impressed. What are you thinking about? Dior asked, catching him watching her. That I built my entire life expecting to choose someone who fit into it perfectly, Gisul said. And instead I got the one person who made me tear the whole thing down and build something better in its place. Good thing I know a bit about construction, Dior said, and laughed when he pulled her closer, both of them finally, fully, exactly where they belonged. You made it to the end, and that means you're truly part of the Afroco family. Thank you for your support. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be replying as always, and stay subscribed, because the next story is already waiting for you.